So I've been working and conducting evaluations in Indonesia since 1997. And really for me, as from all of us from JPAL, it's a dream come true to open JPAL's newest regional office here. So along with my colleagues Rima Hanna and Abhishek Banerjee, I've spent the last 10 years or more working closely with policymakers to conduct randomized evaluations of large-scale development programs here in Indonesia so that policies can be made more effective. What I'm here to talk about today is to talk about JPAL. What exactly is it that we do, and why randomized evaluations are so important for improving development policy here in Indonesia and around the world. So what is JPAL? JPAL was founded in 2003 as a center in the economics department at MIT. And our belief at JPAL is that development policy can be made more effective if policymakers have access to scientific evidence of what policies work, what policies do not work, and why. And to do that, at JPAL we have three core activities. The first thing we do is we do randomized evaluations to measure the impact of programs and policies. The second thing we do is we train researchers and implementers to conduct these kinds of evaluations. And then finally, we work to translate these findings into concrete policy actions so that development spending and programs can be made more effective. Now, since 2003, we have grown to be over 80 affiliated professors around the world and have 380 ongoing or completed evaluations in 52 countries. And to date, more than 63 million people have been reached by policies found to be effective by JPAL affiliates, including many here in Indonesia. Starting in 2007, we began to open regional offices at leading universities around the world, first in South Asia, then Europe, then Latin America, then Africa, and today, Indonesia joins this global movement with our newest Southeast Asia office based here at LPM UI. Now, what I'd like to do now in the remainder of my talk is to talk a little bit more about what JPAL does by talking about two examples coming from my own work and that of my colleagues here in Indonesia. So this year is JPAL's 10th anniversary. So what was I doing 10 years ago? So 10 years ago, I was here in Indonesia conducting research trying to find a way to solve a very complex problem. And the problem was corruption in infrastructure projects in KDP, which has subsequently been expanded to PAM Mandiri. So KDP and now PAM, as many of you know, gives communities grants to do many things, but one of the things that they do is to improve local infrastructure. For example, they build rural roads. Now the problem that was discussed was that people were reporting more expenditures than they were actually probably spending, and potentially they were pocketing the difference. So what we wanted to do was to investigate two potential solutions to this problem of how to reduce corruption in road projects. And the two solutions we wanted to investigate were, first, whether it would be effective to increase the likelihood of being audited by the government audit agency, BPKP, and the second thing we wanted to investigate was whether enhanced community monitoring would be effective at reducing corruption. Now, when we started, we had reason to think that both audit and community monitoring might be effective, and enhanced community monitoring might be effective in reducing corruption, and together with our partners, both at the World Bank and at the Ministry of Home Affairs, it wasn't necessarily obvious which of these, if any, was going to be effective. So, up front, we just didn't really know which one, if any, would work, and if so, which one would reduce corruption more. So how do we use a randomized controlled trial to answer these questions? So I'm going to take the audits as an example. So what did we do? We randomly assigned some kecamatan's to receive the audits from BPKP, and randomly selected other kecamatan's to serve as the control group. And likewise, we did the same thing for enhanced community monitoring. Now, because the two different groups were assigned by lottery, they're statistically similar before we started, right? Because the only difference between them is the result of the lottery, or the randomization. And what that means is that any difference we see between the two groups can be attributed to the impact of the audits. Now, in this particular case, we're interested in measuring corruption. Now, measuring corruption is difficult, right? Because you can't just go ask someone, well, how much did you take out of the road project? They won't tell you. And measuring perceptions of corruption can be misleading. So in this case, we instead trained teams of engineers to estimate the actual cost of building the roads by taking core samples from the roads and even testing them based on our own test roads. And then corruption was measured by comparing our estimate of what the road cost to build with what the village reported it spent on the project on a line item by line item basis. Okay, so what did we find? So overall, if you just compare the group that was randomly selected to receive the audits and the group that was randomly selected to become the control group, what you can see is that missing expenditures were substantially lower in the group that received the audits by about a third. Okay, so that's the impact of the program. Now it turns out that's not the whole story. So audits were effective at reducing the missing materials, as you can see here, but actually when we looked at enhanced community participation, it was more effective at reducing missing wages, wages that should have been paid to villagers that weren't, which fell by about half. Now, it turns out if you probe deeper, enhanced community participation only worked when measures were taken to prevent elite capture, in particular by distributing invitations to community monitoring meetings by schools and not sending them home through sort of the neighborhood associations, Airte, Airway, and so on. So what randomized controlled trials allow us to do is to understand both whether these interventions work and also help us understand why. And they help us answer questions about cause and effect that are otherwise very difficult to answer. So now moving to a more recent example. In 2008, myself, Rima Hanna, Abhijit Banerjee, Vivialitas of the World Bank, and some of our other many colleagues began to collaborate with the government through Bapanas, BPS, and TMP2AK to try to solve another very complex issue, making sure that social assistance programs are reaching the poorest households who are eligible to receive them and aren't going to richer ineligible households. So how do we actually target programs to the right people? Now, why is this even a hard problem? Why is it hard to figure out who's poor? Well, the problem is that in poor countries, in many poor countries, and this is true in a place like Indonesia as well, many poor households don't have income records, right? So it's very hard for the government to know without doing something more who is poor and who is not. And there are a few different methods that governments use to get around this problem. So for example, one thing you could do is you could do a proxy means test. This is when the government sends enumerators to find out information on people's assets, like what kind of house they have and whatnot, and use these assets to figure out, to predict the household's income, okay, by collecting the simple information about what assets they own. Now another approach would be to involve the local community in identifying poor households, right? And this idea of sort of having community meetings and having the community tell you who they think is really, really poor, well, that could be effective if the community had better information than you would get from a proxy means test about who was poor. So the evaluation question, right, the question that JPAL can help answer, is which of these methods is most effective at reducing targeting errors? Now in principle, there's arguments kind of for or against it, but ultimately, it's an empirical question as to which of these methods does a better job identifying the poor. So once again, how do we use a randomized controlled trial to help answer this question? Well, in this case, we randomly assigned some villages to proxy means tests and other villages to community-based targeting to see which methods led to more accurate targeting and improved community satisfaction with the results of the targeting process. And once again, because we assigned which village to which targeting treatment randomly, the groups of villages are statistically similar when we started, which means that any differences in the targeting are due to the differences in the targeting methods we used. Okay, so what did we find? What we found in our case was that proxy means tests, the sort of the asset-based approach, did better at identifying more households living on on $2 of purchasing power parity or less per person per day. They did about 10% better. On the other hand, if you actually asked people in the community which results they were more satisfied with, communities seemed to be more satisfied with community-based methods of targeting, about an 8% increase in reported satisfaction. And community-based targeting also better matched people's own concepts of poverty. So in some sense, this particular study presents a trade-off. It's not that one method is definitely better than the other. They have pros and cons, which the government can then use in thinking about when either method would be more appropriate. So why then are randomized evaluations important? What I've tried to convey through these two examples is that randomized evaluations provide credible, rigorous answers to policy-relevant questions. And they provide useful inputs, we hope, into the policymaking process by providing this kind of rigorous evidence, particularly when the government or potentially with NGOs or other organizations are rolling out or piloting new programs or making changes to existing programs that they really want to understand what the impacts are. And we hope that with this JPAL office here, we'll be able to build on this body of existing work, but also we're hoping to develop new evaluations to help provide rigorous answers to the new set of policy questions that Indonesia faces over the coming years. Thank you very much.